Now let's get into the book reading. I'm excited for this. I've been busy. My life's been very busy. So for me to read books like I would used to, at least, once or twice a week for a couple hours, it's been very hard to do with me starting my book business. And so to counteract that, to have like a double duality utility, a double whammy of positivity for this, I've been reading out loud different books in my collection on live stream. Not only it helps you guys, it helps me keep sharp reading, and you learn different things about different books. So again, I love to invest in, and I love to collect in investment type books, financial books. They are seen as investments as well. Signed copies are better, first editions the better. In context and content within that niche is important too. So this is Inside Wall Street by Robert Sobel, copyright 1977. And again, it was signed by Robert. He called it Bob, Bob Sobel, but it's, Robert as well. 1977. Continuity and change in the financial district. First edition. There you go. And so my plan is to read the introduction and a little bit of chapter one, and just to keep the mind sharp a little bit. This is how I've been keeping myself sharp. So we'll see how much we get through. I'm not trying to, make this too long, but you'll be able to listen to this later, and hopefully you learn something. So we'll start with the introduction. It may well be that New York is in the process of losing its position as a preeminent world financial capital. But if over the next dozen years or so, the city's financial district disgorged some of its banks and trust companies, and those that remained had to share power with outsiders, and should be the two major security exchanges decline, merge, and then become part of a national system centered in Washington or some other place, the politicians still might attempt to preserve the area for tourists. As we know, that didn't happen. This is 1977. New York Stock Exchange still around. NASDAQ. Texas might have a stock exchange now. So there have been a lot of changes, but Wall Street really has not condensed. Not in what he thought this first introduction. Out-of-towners and foreigners swarm through the district throughout the year, providing the city with substantial revenues. These visitors go to the Statue of Liberty and getting off the ferry, head north along Broadway or Broad Street to see the sub-treasury, the exchanges, Trinity Church, and the Nassau Street shopping area, the South Street Seaport and Museum, and the World Trade Center. They can find the romance of history in Lower Manhattan and a flavor of time and life absent from most other parts of the city. The streets, lanes, and alleys of Lower Manhattan indicate much of the story of New Amsterdam and early New York. Visitors can wander through the street, treading on what originally had been cow paths, William, Hanover, Thames, Rector Streets, and others. When the Dutch ruled, there was a large area to the west of Trinity Church that was swamp and estuary, homes for migrating birds. Lobsters and oysters were taken from the waters off Liberty, Carlisle, and Cedar Streets. At high tides, small boats meandered atop what is now the site of the American Stock Exchange, and the land to the north and east was dotted with ponds and rivulets. Close to 2 centuries ago, when landfill operations began, Lower Manhattan looked like a small town. The twisting cow paths were about to become streets with small houses and shops on either side. Here lived Washington, Hamilton, Adams, and others in the national government. The cattle still came down Lower Broadway, and there were slaughterhouses on the west side. But then Wall Street was the city's most important thoroughfare. Farmers would take their grain down to the city and now what are Carlisle and Rector Streets, while foreign shipping dock along the East River to discharge coffee, dry goods, and other products. The homes and offices of merchants and petty bankers were located on the street, one of the most important commercial centers in the New World. Some of the men who lived and worked in them became securities dealers soon after. And in 1792, a handful came together to form the forerunner of the New York Stock Exchange. So in 1792. So that's the real humble beginnings of the stock market. I could go a lot more into the introduction, but I want to get to the first page, like the first chapter a little bit, because it's going to go into the little bit of history as well. Actually, we'll finish the introduction because I think it's giving great knowledge. Those whose lives were centered on Lower Manhattan showed no inclination to alter the dimensions of their lanes and streets, and neither did the municipal governments, which they usually controlled. They erected wooden buildings in the first half of the 19th century with offices on the street level and living quarters above. Many of these were leveled by great fires. In 1835, conflagrations destroyed every wooden edifice below the present site of City Hall, and 10 years later, a second fire resulted in widespread bankruptcies in young insurance industry. Most of these residencies that remained were razed during the next generation and replaced by office structures. As the owners moved uptown, often to the countrified atmosphere of Greenwich or Chelsea, the last of the wooden structures were torn down toward the end of the century, as the district underwent a major building boom and entered the skyscraper age. The periodic reconstruction of Lower Manhattan continued throughout the 20th century, with a lull during the 1930s and early 1940s, which was more than compensated by a spectacular effort in the 1950s and 60s. Most of office buildings along Wall and Boss Streets were pre-World War II, however, but on the periphery of the great T-shaped skeleton that is the center of the financial district, there are several major examples of post-war architecture, the most obvious being the World Trade Center. Now, I'm going to read a couple pages from chapter 1. I'm not trying to bore you guys, need to get the book too. But chapter 1, 1877, we'll see what they talk about. I don't know what they'll talk about, but we'll see. Just, we're reading, this is casual. This is casual. Christmas, 1876, and Cornelius Vanderbilt, age 82, rested in bed in his Fifth Avenue mansion not far away from Washington Square. Several doctors were in attendance as they had been the past several months. The notorious Claflin sisters, Tennessee and Victoria, were there as well. Spiritualists and stockbrokers, journalists and politicians, their interests coincided with those of Vanderbilt, who had sponsored their careers and at one time had proposed marriage to Tennessee. Now they use their magic and charms in an attempt to restore his health. I love magic. It's part of money too. Magic is part of money. The sisters had placed salt cellars beneath the feet of his bed, and Tennessee had seen to mutter chants. These may have had some effect, for several times that autumn. Vanderbilt was aroused from what the doctors thought was terminal torpor. In the downstairs parlor was Frankie Crawford, Vanderbilt's 38-year-old second wife, awaiting the end with some of her stepchildren, all of whom were older than she. Occasionally, they would appear in the bedroom door to inquire about the old man's health, but most of the time they were turned away. Vanderbilt knew the end was near. He arranged to enlarge the family mausoleum on Staten Island to receive his body and those of his children where they died. More important, he rewrote his will so as to leave the bulk of his more than $100 million estate to his son, William, who was enjoined not to sell off the major holdings. To do so would only enrich the bankers, brokers, and speculators on Wall Street, and Vanderbilt didn't trust any of them. Vanderbilt survived into the new year, but everyone knew he couldn't last much longer. At his request, Frankie played hymns on the family organ, and the sound of them prompted rumors that the old man has died. A reporter spoke to a doctor of his suspicions. Vanderbilt listened at the door and shouted, "That's a damn lie." But on the evening of January 4th, the doctors called the family into the bedroom to say farewell. Frankie sang, "Near my God to thee." Vanderbilt raised his head and whispered, "I'll never give up my trust in Jesus." Earlier the next morning, he was dead. All the city's newspapers carried reports of Vanderbilt's death, and the larger ones published long articles outlining his career, assessing his impact. Vanderbilt had been born into relative poverty and had risen to become a steamboat tycoon, a leader in transoceanic transport, and a master builder. He had been a world figure, fomenting a revolution in Central America and putting together the pieces that went into the making of the New York Central and Hudson Railroad and other Vanderbilt railroads that crossed the Mississippi. He was best known for his financial exploits. However, Vanderbilt had been a central figure on Wall Street for the past 20 years. Together with often in opposition to Daniel Drew, Jim Fisk, and Jay Gould, he had created corners, manipulated major railroads, coerced politicians, bought judges, and participated panics. This is all part of Wall Street. You know, it's not as clean a game as what people think. You don't have to do dirt, but if you know the Vanderbilts of the world, if you want those type of riches, unfortunately, you're going to have to do dirt. But you don't have to. Like you can still be moral in the stock market, right? I fully believe that. But you can't be a punk, right? You can't be a punk, but you can still be moral. You know, you can't be soft. He had been one of the half dozen most powerful businessmen in America, and certainly the central one in New York. He who was the head in front of a great company has finally succumbed to a monopoly greater than he. Wrote one journalist, who thought the city would reverberate with the news of his death. How Wall Street trembled as the fact became patent that Vanderbilt was no more. New York was too sophisticated a place in 1877 to undergo trauma at the passing of even so powerful a man as Vanderbilt. And in many cases, his death had been anticipated. And Wall Street did not quiver. The week prior to Vanderbilt's death, official reported volume at the New York Stock Exchange auctions to be at 406,000 shares, or slightly more than 80,000 per session, while outside trading was not unusually large. True, a Vanderbilt road, the Lake Shore, had dominated trading, with 225,000 shares changing hands, but this was due to more unexpected losses rather than fears of a new management. Volume rose slightly when news of his death reached the street. Still, only 98,000 shares were auctioned, with Lakeshore accounting for 36,000 of them in closing firm. The New York Central and Hudson, Vanderbilt's pride, closed unchanged, with 5,000 shares being auctioned. So I'll stop it there for that. I think that's a good, insight to this book. I haven't read this. I'm probably going to have to read this actually because it's actually kind of interesting. Just what I read off right there. But Inside Wall Street by Robert Sobel, talking about Vanderbilt on chapter 1. He was going through the history of the stock market, how the New York and Stock Exchange came to be. So I'm probably actually going to put this on my reading list for some time in the future. If you already have this book, if you don't have this book, go get it. And hopefully you liked this reading.